My name is Klaus Hoeyer. I'm trained in anthropology, but I currently work in a public health department at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Back in the 1990s, when I was studying anthropology, the notion of anthropology at home was a major issue. We would learn how anthropology was about making what might seem strange and alien because it's foreign more familiar, but also about using comparisons to make the familiar and natural just a little strange, or at least strange enough for it to be available for new forms of reflection. Still, it took almost 20 years in a public health department before I was realizing that I was living in the middle of something very exotic in need of special reflection. It was when I realized that I was living in an extremely data-intensive environment. My public health colleagues were conducting research using data from the entire population. They can do so because each individual in Denmark is assigned a personal identifier. This identifier is used in all interactions with public services. And because Denmark is a welfare state, there's data on interactions with not just doctors and nurses, but also educational services and social services, all on the same number. This makes it possible to consider the entire nation, with everyone living in it, as some form of research cohort. Then, I think it was around 2014 or 15, I started hearing people talk about these data resources as something quite extraordinary. I had not realized that Denmark was special in this regard. I more or less just assumed everybody had that kind of stuff. However, the people were now speaking about our health records as a form of gold mine. And ironically, they also spoke about a need for changing this whole resource through disruption. I began attending conferences, that kind of posh events where there's a lot of polished posters and business partners offering nice food. And at these events, I would hear high-profile civil servants. I would hear researchers and also business representatives talk about how big data would make everything more seamless and easy and good. The only thing needed was actually just increased access to more data. And they said we needed to invest in data integration and removal of legal barriers. Simultaneously, however, I would also hear clinicians in the hospitals talk about something they would call the documentation burden or meaningless work. And I realized there was something important to be learned from the Danish experience. I mean, there were literally hundreds of delegations from other countries coming to Denmark each year to learn about data integration. But it was also clear from all the talk about the documentation burden that this might not be a simple case to be copied. So I formulated a research project where I was suggesting to study what's driving this data intensification of healthcare and how does it affect the health services. I absolutely loved hearing the stories from the people I was beginning to interview. People in very different positions would tell a range of stories about the need for more data and all the problems it could solve and why data analysis would be essential for what they wanted to know. Data really could help some people do very important things. However, I would also hear stories about frustrating or even clinically absurd forms of data collection, about stupid analysis and idiotic misunderstandings of data. And often I would think that this could not all be true and try to figure out who's actually getting this one wrong. Then it gradually dawned on me. The conflicting stories was the very point I'd been looking for as I was searching for answers to what are the implications of increased data integration. Because integration of data resources in order to give access to data makes data ontologically multiple. That means data elements come to work like cogs that have to operate in several machines at the same time. A simple thing, like a diagnostic code, is now supposed to be used by many different people wanting to produce very different types of goods. Clinicians wanting to produce health, administrators who want to produce good governance, industry who wants to produce money, and of course, researchers, like my colleagues, who want to produce knowledge. However, sometimes when a cog is made to operate in several machines at the same time, there's a danger of friction. It explained then, this ontological multiplicity, why people could tell such different stories, and why they were actually not wrong, but partly true. When, for example, people in the posh conference rooms spoke about data integration as making everything more seamless and easy, it was true for some of them. Administrators and researchers would indeed have data in a much more accessible format now, but it came at a cost. Clinicians had to produce more data and produce them in formats that did not necessarily make sense, clinically speaking. Another example was when the director of the National Health Authority announced that psychiatric codes among the young were no longer valid for clinical and research purposes. Whoa, that was a surprising message, considering how Danish data were always praised internationally. His point was, however, that because municipalities had begun requesting a diagnostic code before offering special assistance out in schools, the coding practices had changed. When they wanted health data to serve the purpose of more fair allocation of school resources, these data could no longer be used in the same way for research and clinical purposes. So in the process of living immersed in data intensity, I learned how data integration produces a form of situation in which the different purposes interact in detrimental ways with one another. I also learned that opposite stories need not be wrong, but they can both be partly true. This is why I decided to call the book I wrote about the project in the end for Data Paradoxes. This project taught me that when somebody says that this or that digital initiative is just good or bad, I need to ask, good for whom and good according to which criteria? Because by dismantling some of the normativity, we can pose better questions, we can improve our curiosity, and we gain the ability to question the norms we otherwise take for granted, which is absolutely essential for doing anthropology at home.